So last class we were walking through Kant's categorical imperative. And by now you should know that this has two conditions for how we should treat people, two conditions for actions. One, we cannot use people, never, as mere means to an end. Secondly, we sometimes have to treat people as ends in themselves. And what we're going to do today is we're going to look at a couple of ethical questions and see what Kant would say with respect to these questions. Now, we've already looked in the past at a couple of these and seen what utilitarians would say about it. And what we're going to do is we're going to kind of compare and contrast what Kant would recommend and why he would recommend different actions over what the utilitarian says. And we're going to begin by once again revisiting the question of what kinds of duties, if any, do we have to alleviate suffering for people living in dire conditions, people living in third world nations. And we've seen what the utilitarian would say about this. If you recall, what a utilitarian does is she appeals to the principle of utility. And the principle of utility, as you should know by now, says that actions are right insofar as they promote aggregate happiness and wrong insofar as they promote aggregate pain. And so for the utilitarian, should we help people in third world countries? That question is answered just by simply calculating whether or not helping would bring about more happiness or more pain in the world. If it would bring about more total happiness to help people, then we're morally required. If it would bring about more total pain in the world to help people, then we're morally forbidden from doing so. And not only do we answer the general question, should we help, yes or no, should we help people by appealing to the principle of utility, but the principle of utility is going to also exactly answer how much help we should give. And here again, it's really interesting because the principle of utility is at least in principle committed to this idea that we might have to give all of our additional resources, all of our luxury goods to helping people in dire conditions if that would bring about more happiness. And so it was really interesting because the utilitarian theory, as we saw, it really highlights that your property rights aren't very restrictive rights at all. In fact, they're non-existent property. You don't really have property rights. If in the end it would benefit and bring about more happiness for you to sell everything you own and give it all away to charity, then the utilitarian says that's exactly what you should do. Even if it would make your life worse off than the people you're trying to help. If that would bring about more total happiness, then you're required to do that. But what we want to do today is look at and see what a Kantian would say about this same question, our duties to help those in third world countries. And what we're going to do is ask a couple of questions. And the most general one is, do you think that Kant believes that we should lend aid to help people in these kinds of situations? And your general sense is, yeah, it seems like Kant would want to do that. Kant has a huge respect for persons. He thinks we have to treat people with dignity. It seems like Kant would want to help people out. But that's not really sufficient in terms of supplying Kant's answer. We can't just base it on a sheer impression like that. And what we're going to have to do is we're going to have to turn back to his principle of utility. To his categorical imperative. And we're going to have to see what would Kant say based on his categorical imperative about our duties to aid people. And as I was saying a second ago, there are two conditions about actions that are highlighted in Kant's categorical imperative. And the first one is that we should never treat anyone as a mere means to an end. And the second one is that we should only treat people as ends in themselves. And based on these two separate conditions, we're going to see that Kant has different things to say about our duties to help people in these kinds of dire conditions. So we begin with looking at the first condition that we had talked about, that we cannot treat people as mere means. And as I said in the last class, what this amounts to is that you can't force people to do things against their will, and that you cannot deceive people or take advantage of them or their ignorance in any kind of way. We have to treat people in ways at a more general level. We have to treat people in ways to which they could rationally consent. Now, how exactly does this apply to our duties to help people in these kinds of conditions? Well, specifically the way this is going to work itself out is that we can't take advantage of people who suffer from these kinds of situations. So we can't exploit or price gouge or take advantage of their lack of knowledge of something. We can't take advantage of the duress and stress that they're under either. Remember we had talked about when we discussed treating people as mere means to an end. You can't put a gun to someone's head and say, sign on the dotted line or else, because that's not true rational consent. But we can say something very similar. What if you don't have a gun to their head, but what if they haven't eaten in a week? And the only thing that's going to save them is if they sell some piece of property that they have. And so you say, yeah, I'll buy it from you at pennies on the dollar. And you say, well, it's either that or you starve to death. Really and truly, what's the difference between that and putting a gun to someone's head? Again, this is going to come down to your motive when you operate. But if you're trying to screw people out of their money or their land or their property, or you're trying to exploit or price gouge or take advantage of them for your own benefit, then you're really treating them as a mere means to an end. You're not treating them in a way to which they could rationally consent. And Kant says this would always be wrong. And we need to be very, very careful when it comes to our dealings with people in these kinds of conditions, because those are the people who are most susceptible to price gouging. Those are the people who are most susceptible to being exploited and taken advantage of. I'm sure some of you have been fairly hungry before. Maybe you've skipped a meal, or it's been a while since you've eaten. And just even skipping one meal, it can really obstruct your ability to reason carefully and clearly. I've heard it described as being hangry. You're angry because you're hungry. But it really does cloud your judgment. And so think about that. What if you haven't, we're talking about missing a meal, but what if you haven't eaten more than 1,000 calories over the last 2 or 3 weeks? How impaired is your judgment going to be at that point? And this is really interesting because scientists have known for a long time that there is a strong correlation between being poor and being unintelligent. And the general theory was, until fairly recently, that people who are unintelligent are also going to be poor. It's because they're unintelligent that they're going to be poor. But more recent studies have shown that it's the reverse that might be true, that being poor leads to being unintelligent. Well, why is that? Well, because typically when we're talking about absolute poverty here, when you're really, really poor, your brain just basically kicks into survival mode, and you're not able to really weigh and consider long-term implications of your actions. You're just I don't know, running with very clouded judgment, so to speak, and you're only thinking about what's in your immediate survival interest. And so people like that, in that kind of situation, it's really, really easy to take advantage of them because they're just not in a state where they can make clear-headed choices. And so what Kant would say first off, and when we're talking about our duties to help those in third world situation, is that we just have to be really conscious of where they are, of what they're dealing with, of what they're struggling with. And just because they say yes to something doesn't really mean it's something they would rationally consent to. Just because they say yes, it doesn't mean it's a true expression of what they would really, truly want. Maybe it's just their hunger. Maybe it's just their poverty that's doing the talking and not them personally. So that's what Kant would say, number one. Now, we could not treat others as mere means to an end if we just left them alone. If I never had any dealings with really, really poor people, well, then I could easily satisfy my duties to them, right? If I never deal with them, then I can't treat them as mere means to an end. So if that's all that Kant had to say, well, we could help or satisfy these obligations we have very easily. We just leave them alone. Because again, if we leave them alone, well, then we can't mistreat them. But Kant's going to want to say a little bit more than that. And what he's going to say is that we have to treat others as ends in themselves. And if you remember, what this means is that we have to help others achieve their own happiness in life. We have to help them pursue their projects, their goals. And the reason for this, and to remind you again, what makes us special is the exercise of our autonomy, our free will, according to Kant. And so the projects we choose in life, those are a function of our own individuality and our own free will. And our projects are valuable because they are a reflection of who we are as people. And so in order to show respect to a person, you have to show respect to the things that they are interested in and the things that are important to them. But here's a big question. How can people exercise their own autonomy? How can people pursue projects worthwhile if they're just scratching and clawing for their own very survival? It really seems very questionable that they could. It seems like that if all you're concerned about is just getting the next meal, or just fending off invaders, or just fighting some kind of disease or famine, if that's all you're doing constantly, there's no true freedom that you're going to have in life. There's no true autonomy that you can have. And so, again, what Kant says makes us so valuable is that we can exercise a full-fledged freedom. But it's not true freedom if you've only got one course of action, so to speak. It is a great quote from the book The Grapes of Wrath, in which I think one character, he does something that's considered noble and brave, and someone comments and says, "Wow, that was really brave of you." And he said, "It ain't bravery when you've only got one option. When it's either do this or die. That's not true bravery." Likewise, it wouldn't be true freedom either. If you've only got one option, that's not true freedom. And so what Kant says is that we have to help people achieve their own autonomy. We have to help people sustain themselves, and we have to help people pursue worthwhile projects. And so what we're going to have to do, Kant says, is to, number one, help provide minimal conditions for security, food, clothing, shelter, these kinds of things that are necessary for life. But then more than that, Kant says, we're going to have to provide the means for people to stand on their own 2 feet and help themselves. Because again, for Kant, what's so special and morally worthwhile is that you can exercise your own freedom and your own individuality, your own autonomy. That's what really makes you worthwhile. But here's the thing. If you're just in this dependent relationship where somebody else is supplying you with all the things you need for life and you're not providing for yourself, then you're not really exercising your full autonomy. You're in a relationship of a child to a parent. And Kant says that's just not a correct place to be in. And this boils down to, and the reason for this is because of how much emphasis he places on standing on your own 2 feet and being your own person and exercising your own autonomy. And so what Kant would say is that, and a lot of times students ask about what Kant would say about welfare, and personally, well, I have to say that's a complicated thing, but I don't think Kant, for instance, if we want to bring it to an issue that's a little more close to some of us, but for Kant, he wouldn't be against welfare, but he would be against welfare as, you might say, a way of life for some people. He wouldn't be against welfare if it was a stepping stone for you to secure employment and stand on your own 2 feet. But if you're in just this perpetual state of taking a handout, and I don't mean to disparage it in any kind of way, but if you're in a perpetual state of that, Kant would be against it. So, and he would say the same thing for helping people out in these kinds of third world conditions. He would say, look, it's our place to come in and help them, but only to the place where they can fend for themselves. Because there's just something so precious and valuable about being able to stand on your own 2 feet. And so we can see how Kant's answer to this would be very, very different than the utilitarians. For the utilitarian, they wouldn't, in principle, have a problem with establishing this kind of relation of dependency between people, as long as it produced more total happiness in the end. Kant thinks there's something defective about that. He thinks you need to help people stand on their own 2 feet. And you might, I don't know how you feel about this personally, but I think about the things that I've accomplished and I've done by myself. And there is this sense of pride in having done that. There's something, to me, it's much more fulfilling to do things for myself than to have others do them for me. Now, sometimes you have to get other people to do things for you because you just don't have the means to do it. I just think of like simple projects on working on my car. There's certain things I just can't do, so I have to pay someone to do them. But when some mechanical things go wrong and I fix them myself, it just gives me this sense of empowerment and a sense of pride that paying someone else to do it for me just can't touch. And I think that's a lot of what Kant has in mind as well. So now we're going to turn to talking about criminal punishment. And as we saw when we talked about utilitarianism, the utilitarian believes that punishment, the sole reason to punish anyone, is based on some kind of expected social utility. That is to say that the punishment, if it brings about some kind of benefit for society, then it's justified. If it doesn't bring about benefit for society, then you can't punish someone. And what we saw when we talked about the utilitarian theory is that in principle, you could justify punishing the innocent if it brought about some kind of good for society. Likewise, you could justify excessive forms of punishment if it brought about good for society. What we're going to do now, though, is we're going to look at and see what Kant would say about his theory of punishment and why or what justifies punishing people for crimes. And there are two basic principles of Kant's theory of punishment. And one of the first principle is what we call retributivism or retribution. For Kant, he believes that a person should only be punished because they deserve it. So this is the first condition. Only the guilty are punished, the innocent are never punished. And you can see already how this differs from the theory of utilitarian, because they don't believe that you have to be guilty in order to be punished. And just because you are guilty doesn't necessarily mean you will get punished. For them, punishment is strictly a function of, will it benefit society? Secondly, Kant places a condition of proportionality. And what this amounts to is just this, is that punishment should be proportional to the crime. Or another way of saying it is that punishment should fit the crime. You don't, for instance, execute someone for a minor speed infraction. At the same time, if someone commits a serious crime, then they need a serious punishment. So a light crime deserves a light punishment, a serious crime deserves a serious punishment. And Kant actually even believed that people should be executed. If for instance, you commit murder, then a just punishment for that would be that you're executed. Now, this might seem kind of strange that Kant would say this, but I'm going to try to make some sense of it in a second. Before I get to talking about that, though, how Kant could justify something like capital punishment, given everything else he said about never treating people as mere means to an end, I want to just go through and explain some of the underlying justification for these two principles of his theory of punishment. And just like when we talked about our duties to help people in need, here again we're going to need to appeal to his categorical imperative. And once again, there are two parts to this. And first thing Kant says is that you should never treat someone as a mere means to an end. Now, why is this relevant when we're talking about criminal punishment? Well, for just this reason, is that this condition of Kant's categorical imperative, it's going to help justify this idea that we never punish the innocent. And it's also going to help justify the proportionality requirement in his theory of punishment. Well, how so? Well, when we looked at the theory of utilitarianism, what we saw is that we could justify punishing innocent people, and we could justify punishing people excessively if those punishments benefited society. But here's something that Kant would put a block to right there. He would say, you can't punish someone because it benefits society. Because to punish someone for that reason, because it benefits society, would be treating them as mere means to an end. And so what Kant would be able to do is, based on his theory, he'd be able to rule out these kinds of justifications for punishing people. Now, you can't punish the innocent. You have to punish people proportionally. Why? Because the only sound basis it would appear to punish the innocent, the only sound basis there would appear to punish people in a disproportionate fashion is because it benefited society. But, and this is the key part, to punish someone because it benefits society is to punish them because, or to treat them as a mere means to an end. The punishment in that case is because you're treating them as mere means to an end. You're trying to achieve some goal of benefiting society, and that's why you're punishing them. And Kant would forbid this kind of thing. And so you can see how this condition, that we can never treat someone as mere means to an end, how this helps put some roadblocks in place as to what we can do to other people. There are just certain forms of punishment that are going to be off the table for Kant. So that's number one. But the bigger question is, how does Kant justify punishing anyone at all? I mean, it's kind of somewhat clear to me how he could say there's certain things we can't do to people, that we can't, torture them. Why can't we torture them? Because that would be treating them as a mere means to an end. Why can't we send someone to prison for 10 years for, jaywalking? Well, because that would be treating them as mere means to an end. But how does Kant say that we can justify doing something to someone? So let me be clear. I think it's evident how Kant would say that, or could argue that there's certain things we can't do to people based on we can't treat them as mere means to an end. But how does Kant justify saying there are things we can do to people, that we can lock them away, that we can execute them? Doesn't this seem inconsistent with Kant's idea of treating others as ends in themselves? One would think so. One would think that it seems inconsistent with his claim of treating people as mere means to an end. But this is where Kant gets a little tricky here. And what he says is to punish people, far from treating them as mere means to an end, actually respects their autonomy. To punish people, what it does is it acknowledges their rationality. And basically, when you punish someone for a crime that they have committed, you're saying back to that person, by punishing you, I recognize that you understood the implications of your actions, that you have taken this course of action for yourself, and now you have to pay the penalty for having taken this course of action. If you did not punish that person, what you would be doing is in some way denying that they understood or were in control of their actions. So think about that for a second. Why do we excuse people who've done horrible things at times? Well, one reason we might excuse someone and say, we're not going to punish you, is maybe that person couldn't control their actions. Maybe, suppose there was someone who suffered from a mental condition, some kind of schizophrenia, right? And they went on a killing rampage. But then they were diagnosed to have this debilitating condition, and they didn't really understand and they couldn't control their actions. Well, if that's the case, we don't hold them accountable. But why? Because we recognize that they're not fully capable of controlling themselves. They don't have true autonomy. Or think about someone who suffers from Tourette syndrome, where they just yell out obscene words. We don't get mad or in any way criticize this person because we recognize they can't control what they're doing. But if I were just to go out in public places and start yelling obscenities, and I don't have this condition, you might get mad and say, hey, you should stop that. What you're doing is wrong. You shouldn't be yelling these things in public places. And what you're doing in that case is you're saying, you can control your actions, and you should understand that this is not appropriate. And so you are to blame for what you have done. And so this is where I think it's a little confusing maybe, but hopefully you can kind of see what I'm driving at here. To excuse someone for an action requires either saying that they don't understand their actions or that they couldn't control them. But to punish someone, you're saying back to that person, you understood and you could control your actions. And so that's a way of acknowledging their rationality. And so punishing someone, it doesn't in any way treat them as mere means to an end. It actually acknowledges that they are people. And so by holding someone accountable for what they have done is a way, Kant says, and this might seem kind of crazy, but it's a way of showing some level of respect to their personhood. And so Kant, he would actually say that even for executing someone for a crime is a way, as crazy as it might sound, is a way of showing respect to their personhood. It's saying back to that person, all right, you committed this crime, you understood the consequences of your actions, and now we're going to treat you accordingly. You made your bed, now you must lie in it. And so this is Kant's theory of punishment, and you might not agree with it, and you might think it's problematic, but if nothing else, hopefully you can see how he thinks through this. And there are certain things I think that Kant's view of punishment gets right, or at least seems better than the utilitarian. In particular, I think Kant, his idea that you can't have excessive punishments and that only the guilty should be punished, that seems to square much better, I believe, with our thinkings about punishment than a pure utilitarian theory. In truth, I think probably our understanding of what justifies punishment is somewhat of a blend between Kantian and utilitarianism. Now that blend is not entirely consistent. I doubt that our ordinary views are. In fact, this is a big area of moral philosophy, just trying to understand how we justify punishment. Because on the one hand, we sometimes think like utilitarians. On the other, we sometimes think like Kantians. And those don't make for easy bedfellows. They don't really reconcile with one another terribly well. But I think one thing about Kant's theory that he stresses and that he does seem to get right is this idea that you punish only the guilty, and again that the punishment should fit the crime. I want to talk about one further thing, and that is how we treat animals, and what Kant would say versus what the utilitarians would say about our treatment of animals. Now, the utilitarians actually, very interestingly, they said that animals should be given some kind of consideration when we make decisions. Why? Some kind of moral consideration. Because animals can feel pain. And as Jeremy Bentham said, it's not whether something can think or reason, but can it feel? And that's what was central to the utilitarians. So we do have to consider animal pain and animal suffering in any kind of utilitarian calculation. Now, what would Kant say about the mistreatment of animals? Well, here's a place where I think Kant's theory is going to be undesirable to a lot of us. And basically what Kant says is that since animals are not persons, and remember, Kant's understanding of person is narrower than our general understanding of person. Kant doesn't mean human by person. He means something that can exercise free will. And he says since they're not persons, they're not subject to the moral law, and we have no ethical obligations to them. We have no direct duties to animals. And so what Kant would say is that it's not technically immoral to hunt animals for sport. It's not technically immoral to eat animals. It's not technically immoral to torture animals. For Kant, he would say technically it's not immoral, for instance, to douse a kitten in kerosene and set it on fire. Now, I think a lot of us would think, yes, that certainly is immoral. You can't, set a puppy on fire or, throw kittens off a bridge for sport. That wouldn't be moral by, I think, most everybody's standards. But according to Kant, they're not persons, and so it would be no different than chopping down a tree in my backyard. I don't have moral obligations to it. Now, what Kant says about this is that he says technically it's not immoral, but you shouldn't do it. Why does Kant say you shouldn't torture animals? Well, basically he says because if you torture them, it'll desensitize you to pain in animals, which will probably desensitize you to human pain and suffering, and that in the long run might lead you to harm another human being, to maybe torture a human. And so Kant says it's wrong to do these kinds of things to animals, not directly because of how it affects the animal, but because of some indirect consequences that it might bear on your fellow man. Now, I'm not terribly satisfied with this. I think that the most obvious reason of why it's wrong to torture an animal is because of the pain it inflicts on the animal. And that should be, I think, something that probably most everybody agrees upon. That you can't just bludgeon a dog to death because it's fun, and the only reason you shouldn't do it is because you might bludgeon a human being to death. It seems that the more obvious thing here is just, no, it's wrong to do that to the dog. The dog deserves to be treated better than that. Here's a case where you can see Kant's moral philosophy at work Like his ideas about animals and the duties we have to them are going to be much less than what the utilitarian says, because Kant starts with this idea that the only thing that we have moral duties to are persons, and something is a person if and only if it can exercise its autonomy. Animals can't, so animals aren't persons. We don't have moral duties to them. Like I said, this is a one part of his moral philosophy that I think even a lot of modern day Kantians find to be a little embarrassing and unsatisfying. So, having looked over both Kant's theory now and the utilitarians, I'm curious which one you think is better. Do you think Kant's view seems plausible at all? Do you think it captures some important aspects of our ordinary moral thinking? Or do you think it seems more sensible than the utilitarian's view? And can you see any big problems with Kant's view in the long run? You know, I think a lot of student reactions I have once I get to this point, when I have my face-to-face classes, is that having walked through Kant's view, people are more sympathetic to it. People are more sympathetic to it because it does defend these fundamental rights that we have. And that seems to get a lot correct. Because especially when we're thinking about ourselves from the inside, we think there's certain ways I shouldn't be treated. There's just certain things you shouldn't do to me. And once you recognize, hey, there's certain ways I shouldn't be treated, you can apply that more generally and say, well, look, I'm no different than anyone else. If there's certain ways I should never be treated, then there's certain ways I should never treat other people. And that seems like something that Kant's view really captures well. His theory of our duties to help people who are suffering from third world conditions. The utilitarian's view seems to place these extremely demanding conditions on us. Kant, on the other hand, says, hey, you can't ever mistreat people in these situations, and sometimes you have to help them out. Sometimes you have to provide these kinds of minimal conditions. Kant's theory of justice, it seems to get a lot right. We only punish the guilty, and only in proportion to the crime they've committed. There are some problems, I'll admit, with Kant's theory about our duties to animals, but on the whole, you can ask yourself, which view seems a little better, the utilitarian's or the Kantian? And like I said, I often find that many students are more sympathetic at this point to Kant's view. Having said all that, there are some big problems with it. And there's one in particular that I'm going to highlight now. Because as it turns out, I think that Kant's greatest strength ends up being its greatest weakness also. And what this greatest strength is just this, is that for Kant, and here I should, before I say anything, when I say Kant's humanity formula, that's another way of referring to his categorical imperative. I should have corrected that, but Kant's categorical imperative says it's always wrong to treat a person as a mere means to an end. And the problem is, what this implies is there can be absolutely no exceptions. You can never, ever treat someone as a mere means to an end. And anytime you treated someone as a mere means to an end, no matter what, you would be doing something immoral, according to Kant. And let's think about this. I'm going to provide you with an example where maybe sometimes you can treat someone as a mere means to an end, and that is acceptable. Now, here's a case. I don't know if any of you have ever seen this movie. It's a movie by Quentin Tarantino called Inglourious Basterds. And in this particular scene in the movie, what we have is it's set in World War II, and this is a French farmer over on the left, and this guy on the right, he's an SS Nazi officer, and he's come to this guy's house, and he says, "Sir, I heard you're hiding Jewish refugees in your house. You're hiding them." And in this situation, the farmer says, "No, I'm not hiding them." He, in fact, is. They're actually underneath the floorboards right here. Now, if you were in his situation, would the appropriate thing to do, you think, be to lie? Should you tell a lie in order to save someone's life? Should you tell a lie in order to save people who are certainly bound for a concentration camp or a death camp? Would it be acceptable to tell a lie? Would it be morally permissible in this particular situation to lie? And I believe almost everybody I've ever asked says, yes, it would be morally permissible to lie in this situation. And what Kant says is no, it would not be morally permissible to lie in this situation. Why is that? Well, because to lie would be treating this person right here as a mere means to an end. And you might say, yeah, but he deserves to be treated. I mean, he's a bastard after all, right? Hence the name of the movie. But no, he's a terrible person. He wants to kill, and certainly you can lie to a murderer. But here's the thing: Kant doesn't say you can never treat someone as a mere means to an end unless doing so will produce good consequences. Why doesn't he say that? Because if he said that, basically he'd be a utilitarian. If he said you can't treat someone as a mere means to an end unless it would produce good consequences, or it's for a good reason, or it's for a good goal that you have, then he'd be basically just back into utilitarianism, because that's what the utilitarian says. You can treat someone as a mere means to an end if it's for a good cause, or if it produces more happiness in the world. What Kant says is you can never treat someone as a mere means to an end no matter what. Now that's if you're trying to do something that's bad, if you have a bad end, but you also can't treat someone as a mere means to an end if you have a good goal in mind. You can't treat someone as a mere means to an end even if you want to achieve something really nice. And I didn't mention this earlier, and I should have, but when we talk about criminal punishment, Kant is actually against any kind of forced rehab, like to commit someone to rehab, for instance. Kant would say, no, 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 just like Amy Winehouse. He would say, you can't just force someone in. Even though you're trying to do something good for that person, you're forcing them against their will, right? And going back to the example before us right now, Kant would say something very similar. Even if you have a good goal in mind, you cannot manipulate or lie or do anything to treat someone as a mere means to an end, even if you're trying to do something very, very good. In either case, it would be wrong. And we can see right here that Kant, he doesn't allow for any kind of exceptions whatsoever. None. You couldn't lie to someone to save someone's life. You couldn't tell a little innocent white lie, for instance. If someone came to you and said, "This is it on my face really bad," or they were very self-conscious about it, you might say, "Oh no, it's not so noticeable," but inside you're thinking, "Oh my God, that's terrible." But you might tell an innocent little white lie, so to speak, and say, "No, it doesn't look that bad." Kant would say that would be immoral too. And here I think highlights the biggest problem with Kant's moral philosophy is that there can be no exceptions to the moral rules whatsoever. And that seems really, really great because it does protect us from being treated as mere objects. But there also might be conditions where it just seems like it's morally acceptable to just trample over somebody. Or maybe there are conditions where it's morally acceptable to treat someone as a mere means to an end. I'm going to give you one more, and I don't have a slide for this, so pay very careful attention. But suppose there was a situation where you had to kill an innocent person, one innocent person, to save 10 lives. Do you think it would be morally permissible to kill one innocent person to save 10 lives? And now, I'm not saying would you. That's not the question I'm asking, because you might not. Maybe you wouldn't. Maybe you wouldn't have, you'd just be too nervous, or maybe psychologically you couldn't pull the trigger. But the question is, would it be morally permissible to kill one person to save 10 lives? You might think, no, that wouldn't be. Well, what if it wasn't 10 lives? What if it was 100? What if you had to kill one innocent person to save 100 lives? What if, for instance, you could, or what if it wasn't 100? What if it was 1,000? What if it was 1,000,000? You had to kill one innocent person to save 1,000,000 lives. Or what if it was 10 million or 100 million? What if it were 1,000,000,000? What if it was the entire world? What if you only had to kill one innocent person to save the entire world? The question is, would it be morally permissible to do so? Kant says no. Even if it were to save the entire world, it would not be morally permissible to kill one innocent person. And this is what I'm trying to drive at here, is that it seems like on the one hand, yeah, it wouldn't be right to kill one innocent person to save another life, or it wouldn't be right to kill it to save 10 lives. But keep pushing that body count up higher and higher and higher. And there comes a point where you think, gosh, it would be really terrible to have to do this, but it seems like it would be permissible. In fact, some of you might even be thinking you'd be required to kill. What if you had to torture one person horribly, but only by doing that you could save the entire world, right? I think some people might think, yes, it would be morally permissible to torture even a person. If the whole fate of the world hung in the balance, Kant would say absolutely not. You'd have to let all the people on the planet die before you could torture one innocent person. And this is the biggest problem with Kant's moral philosophy. Without question, Kant is an absolutist. And as I said before, there's a sense in which absolutism seems right, because it does get this idea that we should never do things to people. But at the same time, it seems like there could be cases where we have to mistreat people, and it seems permissible to do so. There could be these isolated exceptions where we have to treat people as mere means to an end, and that is something Kant absolutely would not allow. So what's the takeaway from all of this with Kant's moral philosophy? Well, one thing is that one's motive is solely responsible for determining an action's moral worth. And for Kant, the consequences do not determine if an action is moral or immoral. What matters is, were you intending to do the right thing? Were you abiding by, were you acting for the sake of duty? Secondly, our moral obligations are absolute. We don't get to choose them. We're absolutely bound by morality. And then finally, the supreme principle of morality, Kant's categorical imperative, is to respect each person's personhood, including your own. You can never treat people as mere means to an end, and you always have to treat people as ends in themselves.